Okay, let's get started. As we do, I think more people will join us. Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicky Falkof. I am from the Wits Center for Diversity Studies and the DST NRF Saatchi Chair in Critical Diversity Studies. Still not entirely used to saying that because I'm very new to this job. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited about this panel and about this conversation. It's the first time that our center, as far as I'm aware, has worked with the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. So that's also very pleasing because I think this is a nice, productive collaboration. So thank you to Azille and Bembe for suggesting this important topic and for reaching out to us to put this together. And thanks also, huge thanks, as always, to Najiba Deshmukh from Wiser, who has been managing everything behind the scenes and making sure that this actually comes together. So thank you to all of you. Before I begin to introduce our speakers tonight, I just wanted to use moderator's privilege to take a little bit of time and basically answer the big question, one of the big questions, the elephant in the room question, which is a question I get asked all the time as someone who does a lot of research into whiteness and issues around whiteness. It's a question I get asked when I do this work in South Africa, although not a question I tend to get asked when I do this work or present on this work in Europe or Latin America, where people kind of go, oh, right, let's talk about whiteness. You talk about white people. You do this in South Africa and people say to you, but why? Why are you still talking about white people? And the answer to that question is, as far as I'm concerned, as a white scholar on whiteness, we don't have the luxury yet in this country of discounting whiteness, white identity, white power, white supremacy as social and political forces, right? We all know the numbers. We've all read and heard the numbers. We know that white people in South Africa hold a disproportionate amount of social and economic power, as well as soft, less visible, perhaps, political power. The currents that happen within white communities and white society still have the capacity to have a huge impact on South Africa. We cannot go, look, apartheid is over, white people are no longer in charge, they're no longer relevant. When we have people like the DA setting the agenda for a national conversation, we cannot afford to discount whiteness simply because we don't think it should necessarily be relevant in a country in Africa run by a Black African government, as it should be. So that's the initial thing, that it is necessary for us to continue having these conversations, even if many of us may think they're obsolete. The second question, of course, is, why are you talking about Afrikaners? Why are you still talking about Afrikaners? Why are people still talking about Afrikaners? And the answer to that question is, hey, we didn't bring it up. We are talking about Afrikaners because Afrikaners have suddenly exploded into global consciousness again, as they do periodically. And there are a lot of people around the world with very particular positions and very particular ideological interests talking about Afrikaners in specific ways and using the idea of the Afrikaner for very, very particular forms of social and political gain. It is then incredibly important for scholars of and particularly in South Africa to be able to talk clearly about Afrikaners and what Afrikanerdom does, what this identity means, what its consequences might be, and what effects it might have on our broader society. Again, we don't have the luxury of not having these conversations. Which leads me to introducing our speakers for tonight. Unfortunately, Cobus van Staden was not able to join us as he had an unexpected scheduling clash. But we have four fantastic people lined up. I'm going to read you their biographies. The first speaker is Sean Jacobs, who is a professor and director of the graduate program in international affairs at the New School in New York. Sean founded Africa as a Country, which published extensively on white Afrikaans political culture. Those of you who are not aware of Africa as a Country, it's an incredibly useful resource, all free and available online. He is the author of Media in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Post-Colonial Politics in the Age of Globalization, which was published by Indiana University Press and Wits University Press in 2019, and actually includes a chapter titled The Second Afrikaner State in Cyberspace. Our second speaker is Azille Coetzee, who is a writer and a research fellow at the philosophy department at Stellenbosch University. In her research, she explores the relationship between gender and race in colonial logic and the role of gender liberation in the project of decolonization. Her most recent book is an academic monograph titled Desire at the End of the White Line, Notes on the Decolonization of White Afrikaner Femininity, which was actually published this year, so it's very, very new. Following Azille, we will have Siphiwe Dube, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. He has written and supervised on topics including African politics and religion, post-colonial literature, race, religion, masculinities, religion and popular culture, and transitional justice. He's a United World College alumnus, recipient of the Prince of Wales Scholarship, the Don Norton Award, the NRF DST Scarce Skills Development Postdoctoral Research Fellowship, among other honors. His current projects focus on African political theology and the religious new right in post-apartheid South Africa. And then finally, our last speaker is Hannelie Marx Knoetze, who's an associate professor in the Department of Communication Science at UNISA. She's the executive editor of Communicatio, South African Journal for Communication Theory and Research. Her research interests encompass popular culture, representation, identity, critical studies in whiteness, and decolonization, with particular focus on South African media landscapes. Starting with her PhD thesis comparing constructions of whiteness in South African and Flemish soap operas, her work on whiteness has expanded to examine belonging, Zef culture, ignorance making, romanticizing the Boer, and recently reading Yellowstone through the lens of the Afrikaans Klasroman. So we will begin with Sean. Each speaker will have 8 to 10 minutes to talk us through their general ideas around the topic, and we will then open up to a broad Q&A. Sean, if you would please go ahead.
Thank you, Nicky. I'm going to try and stick to the 8 minutes. So much of what I think much of what I'm going to try to say, or the points I'm going to make, I probably argue them better in this this chapter from this 2019 book, The Second Afrikaner State in Cyberspace. And the basic point that I'm going to try and suggest is that very little of what we are observing is entirely new, and that there is a kind of long, more like a short, long history of this, that you can date back, that you could tell the story after apartheid. So that's one of the sort of points I'm going to make, and I'll highlight some kind of key moments in the story that leads us to where we are today. The only difference is that this kind of political course of the most dominant voices within the kind of the Afrikaner public sphere or Afrikaner political organization has been taken up by the government or the state of the most powerful country right in the world, by the United States. So I think that's the only difference in the story that I'm trying to tell. The other thing is, just at the outset, I'm doing this from New York City, in which, as Nicky pointed out, white South Africans, and in particular Afrikaners, have sort of entered the global consciousness. But I think it's useful to say, because it's often, when you're in South Africa, and I was in South Africa in January, what you can miss is that it sounds like South Africa is the center of the conversation. In fact, it's more, South Africa is performing a function in a domestic political debate in which Donald Trump is kind of talking to his own local constituency. And so South Africa is caught up, I think, in two discourses, one around white nationalism, and this is particularly in the politics of MAGA and the Republican Party. And secondly, I think this is probably more of consequence, well, equally of consequence in South Africa, is the way in which South Africa is pivoting away from the US in how it defines its place in the world as a member of the global South, particularly in two spheres. One is in the case they took Israel to the International Court of Justice, to the ICJ, and of course, secondly, these are all things that are well known in South Africa. South Africa's pivot towards BRICS and to the Hague Group, and what some people might refer to as a new global South. So I think that's important, at least to I don't want to say in a way the white right wing in South Africa, or the Afrikaners that have sort of taken on Trump's rhetoric or Trump's call, are more sort of like a foil, or in some people's words, they may be sort of useful idiots in the politics of the United States. So just quickly, I also want to clarify one other thing. in the description initially for this event, there was a reference that Afrikaner is been destabilized, that it doesn't just mean white people anymore. I think I would slightly disagree with this. I think when we mean Afrikaner, we still are referring to white South Africans, and both those people who see themselves, who identify as Afrikaners, define the boundaries of that political identity in that way. So essentially, what is the argument I'm making? I'm just basically saying that up until for much of the history in the 20th century, that white Afrikaner political identity as a singular political identity remained largely uniform and stable, and that its boundaries were effectively policed by a small elite in the state, the security forces, through the schools, the universities, the clergy, and crucially the media, which all contribute to the successful suppression of other Afrikaner identities, and that the end of apartheid disrupted the status quo. So this is not a major revelation. And that here's where I think it gets interesting. The dominant version of Afrikaner identity lost its political power, and the whole identity project became more fluid. And ever since, I would argue, it became up for grabs. And I think what happened after the end of apartheid is that Afrikaner identities, like most post-apartheid identities, are increasingly formed at the intersection of global identity politics and what I think is crucial, symbiotic relationship between political activists and aspects of mainstream South African media and online media, and then emboldened by both the internet and by mainstream media, who's saying they're merely reporting this, Afrikaner civil society groups and media figures tapped into and exploit global discourses of identity politics, including right-wing victim discourse about white genocide, or more acceptable ones around minority rights. And that separately, a symbiotic relationship has developed between three sets of factors: the market imperatives and the cultural politics of Afrikaans media, the rise of new media outlets like self-published blogs, online magazines, and social media like Twitter and Facebook, and then finally the agendas of the new brand of Afrikaans political activists. And so my argument is essentially, after the end of apartheid, there seems to be a withdrawal from politics, behind walls, withdrawing from the political process, but being also at the same time very critical of the political process, very negative about the TRC, not wanting to participate in politics, but in a way very much not voting for initially the National Party breaks up. People are voting beginning to vote for the Democratic Alliance. And by the end of Mandela's term, I suggest that there's then a series of events that happens. And in this chapter, I locate these as one, the centenary of the Anglo-Boer War, and some of the commemorations around that, in which Afrikaners are written in as victims. I mean, these are it's part of history, but this becomes the dominant frame. And then secondly, is there's a media event, the publication of an article on the internet by a journalist, Chris Lowe, who had worked for the South Afrikaner, who was more kind of center-left, and he publishes an article called Boetman is die Bliksem, which is him critiquing this is sort of public sphere discourse in the Afrikaans media. He critiques an article by Willem de Klerk, who's the brother of then the former state president F.W. de Klerk, in which Willem de Klerk calls for sort of a liberal politics among Afrikaners, more inclusive politics. And what Chris Lowe does is I think he's critiquing this sort of from the left, but it gets picked up and weaponized by the figures on the right, and this event leads to this kind of a questioning now of an Afrikaner consensus. The second moment that I describe in this, that I see as part of this process, is the emergence of the relationship between celebrity culture and mainstream media in South Africa. And I look at this particular through the figure of Steve Bogme, who I know now is quite discredited, perhaps in this, or he's more like a side figure, and he's been overtaken by Solidariteit and AfriForum. But there was a period during which he ran a very, so popular culture like begins to shape Afrikaans political culture, and he runs a blog which was called Steve's Spoegblok. I don't know, a Spoegblog, like spitting, like, you know, Steve is spitting out facts. And on this blog, he's basically repeating some of these claims of the Anglo-Boer War centenary, the kind of the politics around Putman, picking up on these right-wing discourses that are operating outside South Africa. And then he parlays that into a book, which he called Mense van my Asem, and in which these are things that I actually read this, studied this whole book that he wrote, in which he writes about his own family's history, but also about Brandweg, and celebrates all that politics. And then there's a series of other popular figures that also develops around that. Of course, there's the famous one, Bok van Blerk, who's more ambivalent. I can talk a little bit about him later. And Sunette Bridges. So there's like a whole kind of public tabloid politics that develop around that. There's also, and I'll finish now, there's two other developments in the story. One is the development of a kind of intellectual current around a group called the Groep van 63, which is around Prague, which was run by Dan Rood. So this is to operate in the sort of the intellectual sphere and to borrow language from kind of French political discourses around globalization and identity politics, and presenting Afrikaans to sort of write Afrikaans, particularly white Afrikaans, into this discourse. But then what happens is, like, even in their own writing, there is a feeling that this is run through a little magazine that they call Vrije Afrikaan, that they are not able to translate what they're doing into a mass politics. They actually concede this. This is Danny Goosen, Johan Rousseau, and a number of other people. And then the final moment, I think, is that then the group that can pick up on this politics at a more mass level is Solidariteit and AfriForum. And so I think I should stop there. But essentially, my point is, there's very little. This is, for me, this doesn't come as a surprise. I think at the end of that chapter, I'd actually said that there were some people who had felt optimistic about the nature of Afrikaner identity because of some of the developments around these cultural festivals like Klein Karoo, Kunstefees, Saint Oosterfees, like all these festivals that developed in South Africa. But in fact, from what Solidariteit were doing and how they were tapping into both kind of right-wing discourses and also using the language of the UN, using the language of minority rights politics in the United States to push these kind of political agendas. But I think I should stop there because I said a lot and named a lot of organizations and institutions. But I'm happy to talk about this if people are interested during the question time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And I think my talk really fits into where you ended. Thank you for that. I will be reflecting a bit on the relative invisibility or seeming inconsequential nature of resistant white Afrikaans voices in white Afrikaner culture. And my focus is specifically white Afrikaner culture and its institutions. So I was at Kaka this weekend, the Klein Karoo National Arts Festival, and I had the kind of whiplash that I realize is so characteristic of my white Afrikaner experience. A festival where you watch truly excellent Afrikaans theater and music, brimming with sex of all kinds, queerings of the language, family, culture, and religion, Marxist and decolonial societal critiques, where you join the theater queers of all races at the late night festival bar, drinking espresso martinis and dancing to Charlie XCX. But then at the same festival, you walk over to the feesterrein, the festival grounds, and it is Robbie Wessels doing the leeuloop, and a sea of big white men in two-tone shirts with big white families and bakkies and brandies. You prepare yourself to spot a MAGA cap. You look at the scale of it, do the math, and remember again that this is the culture. This is the culture that is being fought for by AfriForum in the name of the Afrikaner. So I mean to say that I experience a deep and irreconcilable split in the Afrikaans cultural imaginary or the collective psyche. If you look at the literature, the art films, and the theater, you'd be tempted to think that the Afrikaner has changed for the better, because so much of the art we make in this culture is seriously occupied with opening up and queering Afrikaans identity, exploring new kinds of being in this language and in this place, pushing back against the colonial categories that have made us who we are. This is not all you see, of course, and it's not always successful, but there's an extent to which we expect of serious art in Afrikaans to go against the grain of the structuring tropes and stories of the white Afrikaner past. Why is it not these voices that also get to speak for the Afrikaner when the Afrikaner is saying things very loudly on the world stage? I was wondering this weekend at the KAK&K. And in what relationship does this resistant sensibility stand to the mainstream Afrikaans culture that is so sinisterly consistent in its commitment to narrating the very old plot of white Afrikaner settler identity, structured as a story of white heteropatriarchal genealogy and its God-given claims to land? How do these dissonant sides manage to coexist with so little friction? What does it mean that the culture can be so critical of itself in an artistic register, but that none of this seems to translate to much in a collective political sense? And what does this reveal about our attempts at resistance in this language? These are big questions, and I don't have much time, so I will offer only a few separate but connected thoughts. First, the fact that we see institutionalized forms of Afrikaans higher culture like literature and film open up to its own queering and racial transformation is, of course, hopeful. It means that there are dissident voices in white Afrikaans, that there's a push to create rupture, to expand the contours of inhabitable space in the culture. A striking example would be the literary world, where the past few years I've seen a flourishing of work by young Black Afrikaans writers like Ronaldo Kamfer, who are published by the big, historically white publishing houses, celebrated and awarded major and prestigious literary prizes that were in the past only reserved for white men. On the one hand, it is therefore impossible to conclude that Afrikaans has not been willing to change. On the other hand, though, it is complicated. A Black Afrikaans writer like Ronaldo Kamfer recognizes her canonization as a form of tokenization, an inclusion that allows the Afrikaans literary establishment to think of itself as open and non-racist without committing to structural transformation. In response, Kamfer writes, "Ek soek nie 'n plek langs die tafel nie. I don't want a seat at the table." So I think there's a way in which we can say that Afrikaner whiteness benefits from the art that tries to undo it. It eats it up to expand, reposition, and fortify itself. Another layer here is that high art was from the beginning of the rise of Afrikaner nationalism very intentionally used as a way for the Afrikaner to lay claim to white privilege, as a way to prove European ties, civilized ancestry, to counter the idea that they've indigenized too much to be white anymore. Literature and language were instrumentalized in pivotal ways in the creation of the Afrikaner folk, because the champions of an exclusive white Afrikaner nation recognized the major advantage that a single print language and a culture of letters can bring to the making of a people. My point is that literature, language, and art was therefore from the beginning a symptomatic feature of white Afrikaner self and social mastery, not its political or epistemological displacement. This is why we can criticize extractive capitalism, white privilege, and coloniality all we want in the plays we write and the films we make, without rupturing the systems that keep our kind in place, without risking actual loss of anything. The other point here is that the very old and enduring logic of white Afrikaans culture is a closing down, a digging in. The affect at the heart of it is fear, fear of the other, fear of not belonging somewhere. Any art that too seriously disregards this inborn dread, art that undermines this logic by opening up towards the world and towards the other, by unclenching, relinquishing, looking for radical new ways of relating to land and place. This kind of art is not intelligible in the white Afrikaans cultural register, so it lacks coherence as an Afrikaans cultural product. Art like that loses relevance within the culture. You're on the outside looking in and no one is listening to you. This kind of dynamic also plays out at the level of ordinary life. My partner and I often joke that Cape Town is full of undercover Afrikaners, young white Afrikaans speakers who feel alienated by the farm or heterosexuality or religion or family or the values of their communities growing up, who move to the city to inhabit a different kind of identity, and they often start living their lives in English. I also know that many Black Afrikaans speakers choose to live largely in English in resistance to the historical baggage of the Afrikaans language. So this means that the language loses its sources of internal dissidence. Because why would you stay behind in a culture that closes you off in such harmful ways from a world you so desperately want to be part of? And then on the other side, the new ways in which we inhabit our identities in resistance to what our culture wants us to be do not necessarily offer a banner or cohesive narrative under which to mobilize collectively or to speak in one voice, or at least nothing that stands a fighting chance against the tightly coiled, electric-fenced, heavily armed, mythologized, and well-resourced machine that is white Afrikanerdom. So I guess what I'm getting at is that we are in a double bind with our attempts at inhabiting Afrikaans culture in new ways, institutionalizing it in different registers, at reimagining it in different kinds of relation. If we want to do it from inside the culture, therefore intelligible as Afrikaans, within the Afrikaans cultural imaginary, there's an extent to which we must work according to its logics. And as soon as we do that, we contribute to a very old dynamic, providing the culture with alibis and tokens through which it can claim all kinds of innocence and progress, and this allows us to remain exactly where we are. If, however, our resistant gestures are made outside of the symbolic grammar of white Afrikanerdom, not only will we struggle to find resources or a stage for it, but it will not be legible as Afrikaans. I think this helps to explain the hypervisibility of one kind of Afrikaner narrative and the relative invisibility of others, why there's only one kind of Afrikaans story that manages to garner real traction in the world. I think it also leads one to the conclusion that as white Afrikaners, we are all in a way complicit in the message that our culture manages to send out in the world, even if we think of ourselves as having nothing to do with it. If we want to inhabit this identity in a resistant way, we are going to have to try harder, be more creative. That's me. Thanks.
Thanks, Azille. That's kind of nice way to end off, because where I'm coming in is maybe trying to think a little bit more about how then this narrative of dissonance that you talk about maybe gets translated into the broader global space. And here I want to begin by saying that until recently, I would not have really or honestly counted Trump in the camp of those who speak for the Afrikaner, so to speak, despite his somewhat lame efforts in his first term to push the idea of white genocide as a kind of big thing. And definitely not Elon Musk, because he was not in the picture yet. However, for obvious reasons, that has changed quite significantly. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about how those who are vehemently defending the idea of a dying white race that needs saving from its self-erasure or playing too much into woke ideology are two white billionaires, right, based in the US. And I think Sean pointed it out very well in the beginning that, this then puts this whole tussle of white Afrikanerdom and the question of white race in South Africa in the playing field of American local politics. But for me, what is even more surprising is that in the South African context, those who are calling for the closing of ranks are not doing so under some idealized notion of the folk, as I think both you and Sean have pointed out, that there's been a kind of disaggregation of this notion of a singular folk as such, or even the religious calling of saving of the lost, as would have been the kind of traditional narrative. I think when you think of AfriForum, the Afrikaner Self-Determination Party, Freedom Front Plus, Solidariteit, and Zuid-Landers, only the Zuid-Landers follow a kind of strict Christian ethno-nationalist doctrine. Yet it is common knowledge that it is this firebrand Christian nationalists that put Donald Trump, who stoked them up in his fire, and used them in his campaign by attacking traditional liberal notions of freedom and equality and promising to return America to its glorious days of unequal or legal inequality, so to speak. So I think Christian nationalism becomes an interesting ploy here that is used, right, by Trump to actually promote a specific narrative around reclaiming whiteness, but playing into the whole thing that's also happening in Europe around reclaiming Christianity as the kind of European religion. And so in South Africa, though, I think it's interesting that Christian nationalism is not really taken up in these particular ways by white Afrikaner groups per se. In my own work on Christian nationalism, I've actually pointed out how the Afrikaner Broederbond of the apartheid era was the really true last bastion of white Christian nationalist agenda. And that in the post-apartheid era, this agenda actually has been taken up by Black neo-Pentecostals. And that's a point for another time in terms of how Black conservatives in South Africa are taking up the mantle of kind of white supremacist nationalist ideology, but also then touting it in the name of Christianity and the need to reclaim South Africa for God, etc. The point, though, is that that broad global context of white Christian nationalism, calling for anti-immigration, the reclamation of Europe and America as Christian white nations, all of that, the returning of the politics of the right into their rightful place, is absent in South Africa for the large part, right? What is present, however, in my view, is the insular, the laggard, and very neoliberal blend of white ethno-nationalism. And this begs the question, are then white Afrikaners seeking the kingdom of God in the way that the Broederbond imagined it was doing by promoting apartheid? Or are they, like Trump and Musk, seeking to erect a particular brand of supremacist whiteness as the promised land as such? And I think this is an interesting question, precisely because if you read much of white African social media posts, it is full of the romantic language of moral uprightness and the decay brought on by constitutional democracy, etc. And yet the same people are very quick to undermine any effort, right, aimed at socio-political redress as part of addressing the moral decay. And I think this speaks to your point, Azille, around how there is this kind of dissonance between high culture and then what happens and what we do with that high culture in terms of actually promoting real change as such. So, but I suppose this this approach where you see white Afrikaner political parties and civil organizations primarily concerned with their own survival is nothing new. And I guess it goes hand in hand then with the kind of Calvinist belief that if you are chosen, then you are chosen, whatever the Constitution might say. Such a perspective, in my view, aligns well with the broader white supremacist movement that believes in separation at all costs, lest those not deserving actually also get saved. And for Trump, after all, as president, he would put it, there are too many freeloaders on white prowess. So we need to shave off the chaff, so to speak. So the question is, what are we to do? Right? According to the list I said above, in terms of your Solidariteit, your AfriForum, etc., you bunker in, right? Whether in the name of God, racial purity, or economic hoarding, you bunker in as a community that is assailed from all sides and needs to foster solidarity in the face of perceived threats. But as you've both pointed out, this is not a homogeneous perspective anymore in terms of how you bunker in. And this, for me, is identity politics by other means. Yet you would be hard-pressed to find an acceptance of the fact that identity politics is central to the kind of current Afrikaner discourse, right? Except obviously for I think people like Solidariteit, who then appeal to you as to the Geneva Convention around minority rights issues, as Sean also pointed out. So I think this is where you kind of see this identity politics being taken up in this kind of positive ways. But I think in this context of white supremacy, identity politics is dirty politics that favors those who are not chosen. However, this is exactly the way in which the politics of resistance and change developed by the left, I think, are now being used for laying claim to certain forms of problematic white identities, like supremacist and ethno-nationalist ones touted by the people like Trump, Orban, Le Pen, Musk, and the list goes on and on. So the question of who speaks for the Afrikaner is not only a localized one, I think we recognize that, but has a global resonance. And I think South Africa is again, and here maybe I agree more with Sean, serving as a kind of exceptional state of racialized politics where what happens here will foretell the future of the human, just like apartheid foretold the future of a dying idea of racialization, apparently, or the TRC and this Truth Commission inquiries resulted in this great nation of different but singular visioned people who wanted to see a great nation come into being. And so I think here, once again, it's interesting to kind of talk about what does it mean then for Afrikaner identity to be so central to this question of global politics, and what role, and I think Azille, you asked this question right, what role then is the Afrikaner person, the individual, to play in negotiating this attractive call, the siren call, to be part of the reclamation of whiteness, versus what then we're trying to do in countries like South Africa, which is to actually do away with negative difference and see positives and try to kind of work that in good ways. So for me, this is where the question, going back to what Nicky was saying, the question of why whiteness all over again, well, it's because once again, it's 1492, once again, it's 1652, once again, it's, Berlin Conference, once again, right? So this is why for me, it's important to kind of ask these questions, and also to invite then those on the side of the Afrikaner identity to reflect what might it mean going forward then to be part of this problematic and problematized identity as such. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I don't know if it's a benefit or a curse to be the last speaker, because I think, like Sean said, I'm probably not going to tell you anything new, but maybe I can underscore some of what the other speakers have said. My particular point of entry into this debate would be my work and interest in constructions of whiteness and its manifestations in popular cultural texts. So the invisibility which comes with normativity is considered one of the most enduring characteristics of whiteness. However, while whiteness in the South African context still to some extent, and I think this is a point that some of the speakers have made, connotes a normative position of power, the key difference locally lies in the fact that whites are in the minority. And because of this, taken together with our political and historical prominence, white people's racialization in South Africa is not as obscured from consciousness as in other heartlands of whiteness, as Steyn calls it. Particularly in contemporary South Africa, according to Steyn, the relatively disempowered, and I think Sean mentioned this as well, relationship to the state and to political power positions whiteness here differently than in other places where it's theorized. It's hyper-visible. And of course, adding to this visibility is recent developments which saw international role players like Trump and Musk take a renewed interest in South Africa and the Afrikaner boer in particular. So while talking about the Afrikaner in the context of the lived and real problems faced in South Africa on a ground level might seem frivolous, I think it remains an important conversation as long as it's one of many. So in thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, I had some conversations with colleagues and friends, and this was quite insightful. One colleague, and it's useful here to note that she does not identify as an Afrikaner, responded, "Very cool. I will attempt to hear you speak for the Afrikaner." She was being supportive and, of course, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but this made the question posed by this roundtable hit home for me. Because am I able or willing to speak for a group of people to whom I no doubt have some belonging, but which I cannot quite pin down? And if not me, then who? Another friend, upon receiving my invitation to attend this discussion, said, "Al Afrikaner wat ek ken is die stink Afrikaner." She's referring to the marigold flowers. I tried to procure one as a prop for tonight, but it seems that, like or unlike some other iterations of the Afrikaner, they are not in bloom right now. So apart from the flower, my friends, is trying to define the Afrikaner seems like catching water. So I will not attempt a definition, but rather try to speak to the contested nature of the concept. One indisputable, if fluid, to stay with my metaphor, characteristic of Afrikaner identity remains whiteness. And in this context, Afrikaner whiteness becomes even more distinguishable from normative whiteness. Because Afrikaners constructed their identities as in a position opposition to the one hand Black identities, the other Anglo-whiteness, resulting in what Van der Westhuizen has called a lesser whiteness. Historically then, Afrikaners have always been classified as just about white enough in relation to the hegemonic normative whiteness represented by British colonialists and subsequently white English-speaking South Africans, which in turn draws on the global constructions of Anglo-whiteness. Thus, Afrikaner whiteness have, since its inception, found itself in a perpetual state of unbelonging, while still clinging to white hegemony. So, and I would argue that there is much the same with other markers of Afrikaner identity. Another point that Azille made is that the Afrikaans language, as another case in point, does not belong to Afrikaners exclusively. So there's something here about the tension between group identity and individualism and how this relates to power. In the work that I've read by Siphiwe, he speaks about possessive individualism, and I think that's something we can speak to in the questions section. So if popular cultural texts can be read as a reflection of contemporary society, as I argue, and I think Azille argues the same and Sean argues the same, Afrikaans music, as one example, shows how disjointed this identity is. I'm going to name 3 examples, and they are intentionally provocative and necessarily brief. Danny Smoke sings, "Mooi was nog nooit lelik nie, jy het 'n lyfe yskas skuif. Stywe broekie, boerpampoene, bloedrooi skoene." I don't know if that merits translation, but it's got something to do with the long-arm dance and tight pants and red shoes. Then Steve and Bobby, Roan and Jay sings, "Ek los vir jou die son en die see en die land, my kind, my vlag sal aanhou waai, die sade sal ek saai vir jou," which connotes a kind of investment in land and in the country and in how it belongs to generations to come. And then my favorite, Van Pletsen sings, "Things can be kak, but also great. So what do you do when it's both gelyk?" Owning my own positionality in this debate is important to me, and that situates me as white and Afrikaans, born and bred in Snor City, but also as female and as a mother. And these and all my other markers of identity should, of course, be read intersectionally, but let's briefly pause at gender. A lot of the narratives related to the Afrikaner, as illustrated in the examples I just gave you, centers around a specific set of gendered, moral, behavioral norms, which for a white Afrikaner woman translates into ordentlikheid or decency and fulfilling my role as a volksmoeder. local scholars like Stein van Westhuizen and obviously Nicky and Azille have made some headway in problematizing the positionality of the nice white women, our anxiety, and asking questions about how it is that we are still sitting pretty. But how are we reimagining ourselves in opposition to colonial ideas of race, gender, sexuality, and class? Because if you look at what is representing, at who is representing the Afrikaner, to America at least, it seems to still be very much a his story. So diagonalism, as theorized by Callison and Slobodian, but made comprehensible to me by Naomi Klein, is the closest I can come to understanding these contradictory narratives, and particularly how they are playing out in the loudest public representations of the Afrikaner. One example that is particularly relevant, and I think this links in some way to what Siphiwe said, is that's particularly relevant to the South Africans I have encountered that buy in Trump's narrative is the way in which they foreground Christian values, the key characteristic of the Afrikaner, while they are able to overlook the fact that Trump's behavior, the philandering, the alleged sexual assaults, the lying, the cruelty, violates those values. Klein writes, and this is another provocative quote that I'm including on purpose, to get over all that, they had to cast him as the Lord's messy messenger, put on earth to fight God's own doppelganger, the devil, and with stakes as high as eternal salvation, what's a little pussy grabbing? So apart from binary oppositions, what we see here is a lot of instances where diagonal lines between seemingly disparate narratives race towards each other. This is a lot, and the other speakers have said a lot, but I am going to end my 2 cents with 3 questions. The first is, with the unambiguous radical manifestations of Afrikaner whiteness and victimhood, like we are seeing now with the myth of white genocide, it's hard not to lash out and be defensive. Gray, however, warns that this kind of binary opposition leads to a problematic feedback loop that prevents critical analysis of both the alt-right as well as one's own theories, where the term alt-right becomes a term of convenience and the moniker exists now more as a weaponized label used by opponents to accuse others of extremism. So my question is, in our reaction, or in my reaction, how do I resist simplistic and in some ways therapeutic methods used by us as anti-racist authors or thinkers without merely reaffirming our own assumptions and prejudices? Linked to this, and this is my second question, is the perceived distance between academic and popular discussions. And I think this links well with what Azille said. I found many reactions that describes conversations such as this one, driven by noisy liberals, asking what this group of noisemakers proposes as an alternative other than philosophizing about it on television programs or in front of a group of students. And then it accuses these kinds of conversations of, by squabbling over representation, they distract attention from the real purpose of creating a better South Africa for everyone. Another discussion describes conversations such as the one we're having as ahistorical activist hyper-theorizing. And however hard and arguably inaccurate these accusations are, how do we influence these debates on the ground level rather than creating the impression that it happens only in the ivory towers? And then finally, maybe I don't, or I cannot, or I will not speak for the Afrikaner because I am not as sure as AfriForum or Steve or Solidariteit how she looks. Perhaps they should also not be that sure. So ultimately, my question is, how do we resist what Adichie refers to as the single story?
Okay, thank you everyone for very, very thoughtful, fairly at times provocative, very dense presentations that I think deserve and merit a lot of discussion. We have just over half an hour-ish for public discussion. I'm opening the floor now to questions. If anyone has anything that they'd like to ask, you are welcome to raise your hand or paste it into the chat. I see people already pasting things into the chat on the side of the call. Also, just to say that this is a complicated and contentious set of issues, and I realize that it may feel emotional for some of us on this call. Please don't make me use millennial language. I almost said it's a safe space. This is a scholarly space where we can speak of things that may feel controversial, may feel difficult. But if things get too heated, I will cut off speakers if necessary. And also, if anyone has a question, could you please be mindful of not letting your question get too long? So I prefer it if people keep what they have to ask our speakers a little bit tighter. As we have no hands currently raised, I'm going to kick us off by asking a general question. And speakers, if you wouldn't mind putting your cameras on for this part of the discussion, as I expect you may all want to jump in at various different times. I wanted to ask something about the issue of language. So, we're talking here about media, culture, and literature to some extent, right? That's really something that's come through in all of your conversations, the way that identity is made through mediatization, through the building of culture. You, Azille and Hannelie, you both briefly mentioned, as our two Afrikaans speakers, who are embedded emotionally in the language. You both mentioned the significance of the language, but I was wondering, this is a question for everyone, if you could perhaps think a little more, if there's anything else that you have to add about not just about Afrikaners, but about Afrikaans. How does the language work in strengthening, weakening, sustaining, or undermining these various identities? Because as someone actually said, I think Siphiwe, it was you, Afrikaners on the global stage don't speak Afrikaans. Afrikaans is something that only happens within South Africa. So how then does the language operate? Anyone's welcome to jump in.
I'll quickly respond. I think Azille will probably have more to say about this, but I think how Afrikaans operates, I had the unfortunate privilege of doing a deep dive into the interviews that's taking place in America now. And one of the arguments that Ernst Wits, for example, presents when he speaks on these American talk shows is that we have a right to exist autonomously because we have our own language and our own culture and our own cultural products. And I think the point that I tried to make is that's not strictly true, because we do not have our own language. The language does not belong to Afrikaners. So I think the language might not be spoken in these kinds of debates, but it is used as an argument to strengthen our individual group identity, which again points to that tension between individualism and group identity. So to my mind, it's used as, in these kinds of debates anyway, as a proof that we have created some cultural output and therefore we should be recognized as a coherent group. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's my 2 cents.
Sean, do you want to jump in?
I can speak. I mean, I'm actually Afrikaans is actually my first language. My mother's from the Karoo, but in any case, and I that's actually the language in which I dream less in that language because I haven't lived in like in the everyday around Afrikaans. But of course, if I'm in South Africa, I can quickly switch over to it. But yeah, I think the point about Afrikaans, I think there's been attempts to kind of disentangle Afrikaans from whiteness, right? That these attempts, and I think Azille, Hannelie has sort of spoken about this, that there's been attempts. I think there's been, particularly in the 1980s, I mean, I've written a little bit about this. There were these attempts for what was called Swart Afrikaans, or another version of what the sort of more well-known version of Alternatief Afrikaans is the Voelvrye one. But there was another one that was actually linked to the UDF. Well, actually, it starts with Black consciousness when people begin to insist in arguing for political rights in Afrikaans. The Freedom Charter gets translated into Afrikaans. There's an insistence in schools, students should be able to, this is among Black Afrikaans speakers or colored Afrikaans speakers. There's also an insistence that the language, to Hannelie's point, is more than just white Afrikaans speakers. And I think this is to end this, after apartheid, there was a moment in which I think clumsily, maybe Naspers was trying to get in on the act. So you had Mnet with its share schemes, with its Afrikaans programming, was trying to do some of this. I'm not talking about, say, the SABC as a public broadcaster or the state. I'm talking of the private sphere. And there was the Burger, for example, in this chapter that I'm referencing, came up with this term Afrikaanses, which was to break with this notion of like a kind of narrow white Afrikaans idea. The only problem was from and there's been some writing, I think Javi Botma, Herman Wasserman has written some of this stuff in kind of media studies. This was often very opportunistic and was linked to kind of the economics of the festival circuit. So kind of like opening up the festivals like the Klinkerhoor and those kind of festivals, more because of there's a market share here that we're after. And just one other quick point. Mamdani has made, I think, one of the most interesting, he made this interesting argument once where he said the only successful post-colonial language project in Africa is Afrikaans. That it's the only project in which a language, this is a speech I think he gave at the University of Cape Town for the TV Davy lecture, people can look it up. And he makes this argument that in most other parts of the post-colonial project, African languages were secondary to, say, French or English, whereas in South Africa, they developed, again, this is, of course, contentious and it's linked to an ethnic nationalist project, but it did become a language of the university. It became a language of science. It had a publishing industry tied to it, book prizes, etc. And so he's saying, like, it's interesting that no other language succeeded into it. And it's ironic that after the end of apartheid, the ANC or the sort of the new post-apartheid government of South Africa didn't extend that to other languages in South Africa.
No, that is a good point. Audrey Brown in the chat has mentioned the question of Afrikaans, which of course is relevant, but is possibly an entirely different discussion, while also being part of the same discussion, of course. We have a question from Leslie Edgar, who has written in the chat, if I can pose a question. Herman Wasserman's 2009 research does speak in the Afrikaans culture. Oh, hang on, I've lost it, sorry. Herman Wasserman's 2009 research does speak in the Afrikaans culture as a commodity sold by Afrikaans media and originally sold by the National Party government. So the culture continues to exist as long as it is bought, is what she's arguing and what Herman is arguing. I'd like to hear from the speakers what their stance, experience is on how Afrikaans culture only exists if there is a stereotypical Afrikaans identity in the Afrikaans media. That's a fantastic question. So without the kind of edifice of Afrikaans media, without, the films and the book van Black and the music and the self-publishing and back in the 80s, the Hannelie Knoetze, and without all of these things, what would happen to Afrikaner identity? What does happen to Afrikaner identity? Are we talking about something that is completely circular, where cultural production reinscribes an identity that otherwise possibly would have been allowed to reshape itself? Azille, Siphiwe, do one of you want to jump in?
I mean, I guess for me, the political utility of the Afrikaans language question has never left the room, right? I mean, just now we just said the Bella Act riots, right, related to the fact that now schools are going to be forced to provide education in a language other than the one that they think they should. i.e. Afrikaans, and enforcing it on everybody because of the whole kind of heritage or that comes with the support that came from the state for certain schools, etc. So the question of the Afrikaans language, I think, for me, is not simply just about commodification, but it's also about politics, right? In that even during the apartheid era, I mean, I went to a Bantu education school. I learned 3 languages, English, Afrikaans, and isiZulu, right? This was in Soweto. So as an academic these days, I can kind of, look back and think, look, who's the fool here? I can speak 3 languages. You can only speak 1. But that's not the experience of everybody, because for a lot of people, having to be forced to learn this language that is not part of their sleeping and dreaming language is also problematic. Yet in corporate offices, young people coming out of our universities are complaining about the fact that they're being spoken to in Afrikaans and deals are being made in Afrikaans. And so that whole question of soft power that actually comes with this language, I think is still very much weaponized in very strategic ways in order to maintain that hierarchy, that this post-colonial language is the only true language of the economy, the only true language of power, etc. So I think for me, I don't want to kind of dumb down the effect of what Afrikaans language, the power that it still carries. Because now if I'm choosing a school, I have to think about, well, is my child going to learn isiZulu at Crawford? Probably, maybe now they might, but Afrikaans definitely, right? And so I think in education, there is still this perception that there is English and Afrikaans and then everybody else, right? And so I think this is important for me to kind of think about the way that the language actually still carries on an everyday educational context. Yeah.
Azille, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I can jump in there on Leslie's question. So I think from the beginning, the Afrikaner there's nothing about it that exists. It's a group of, from its inception, the idea of the Afrikaner, it was a mixed group of people in different parts of the country, coming from different kind of ancestral lineages, different countries, settlers from different places, people speaking the actual different languages, and who have, by the time that Afrikaner nationalism starts to really organize, have also really kind of indigenized, and I know the word is very heavy, but they've kind of really become part of different kinds of South African societies in violent ways, but also in ways sometimes that are not that violent. And so it's a group of people from the beginning that really have nothing in common. And it's a self-invented mythology, this idea of a unified group of people. And I really think it still is. And it takes so much work to keep it together, to maintain this idea that we are the same thing, because, I mean, we really are not. It's so I think, and there's the link to the commodity culture, that it is, to an extent, this idea of the Afrikaner today, in our history, it was for nationalist purposes. Today, it is for kind of privatized capitalist, but people are making money from this idea, and there is money and land vested in this mythology that people can lose when we lose this. So I think, yeah, the media plays a huge role there. And probably if we didn't have this machinery behind this identity, it would fall away, or we would become something else much easier than we are now.
I'm gonna have a quick comment on this. If you think there's long histories of kind of constructing Afrikaans popular culture or just Afrikaans culture outside of the state, right? I mean, there's a really good article, I was just Googling it, that was written on N+1. I think it's called The Sound of Boeremuziek. And it shows you like how the SABC sort of, what's the word? You know, they what they did was like music that was very improvisational, that was, to Azille's point, which is kind of representing this heterogeneous Afrikaner identity of all these different kind of orlams, or you know, Malay, like, which was also these little catch-all phrases of the 19th century. Like all of that was captured in this music, and then these institutions kind of flattened it out or smooth it. Maybe that's the word, smooth it out. And these musicians like Nico Carstens and all these others, they sometimes rebelled against this, but in the end, they sort of get caught in this. The one quick thing I think that was an interesting one was the Antwoord. I think the Antwoord, when it first came out, was sort of playing at the boundaries of working class white identity and working class colored/black identities. And something could have, you know, Isaac Newton, for people who know that this is sort of Audrey's question about Afrikaans, or I insist on calling it Afrikaans, but that's a small point. There could have been something interesting there, but there's the point again, how that music got firstly subject to, I think, tensions about, you know, people who wanted to use it to kind of reimagine Afrikaans identity, but it sort of got, I think it got sort of caught up in sort of white political debates about Afrikaans identity. And then secondly, it then took on a life of its own outside South Africa that had nothing, then it had nothing to do with, when in fact it could have led to something interesting with around Isaac Newton, or now this Nicotine Long, like people like that. I think there's interesting things that could be done around Afrikaans, but I'm struggling to see like how you develop Afrikaans popular culture unless it's not mediated by like, and other people might have other ideas about this, Media 24, Media 24, or I saw the other day, like black kids who go to former Model C schools reading Marula Media. Like, I would like to see how you develop popular organic culture outside of those institutions.
Sean, you know, you remind me of an article that I wrote and actually published quite early on in my academic career when I was still doing my PhD, which I'm very embarrassed about now, which was kind of utopian enthusiasm about Die Antwoord offering a new possibility of thinking about white Afrikaans masculinity beyond the hegemonies. I look at that now, I'm like, ooh, okay, that was naive. Another question in the chat that comes from Danielle Britz, again about media culture. She's asking specifically about film culture. How prevalent, or to what scale do you think narratives perpetuate this prevailing culture of white victimhood? In terms of audience reception of such films like Treurgrond or Modder en Bloed, which contain such hegemonic forms of Afrikanerdom, how radical do you think the effects of such films might be on how Afrikaners imagine themselves? Considering that films which offer the counterculture often make a loss or perform significantly poorer at the box office. Also, a very interesting question for me, because a friend of mine is currently in Cape Town filming Die Reuk van Appels, which is a countercultural Afrikaans film with, you know, very complex versions of Afrikaner identity. And like Skoonheid, the likelihood is that it will be successful internationally and tank here, because that's not what the Afrikaans media audience wants to see in general. So yeah, does anyone have any thoughts about this question about film culture and white victimhood specifically?
Nicky, I think I have a response to both of those questions, and maybe like you, I also had hope for the Antwoord or what they're doing. But I think what is still hopeful here is that there is a continuous pushback, right? And if you look at Peach van Pletsen's Prating or something like that, there is, and they have a huge following. I think they have a YouTube channel of, it's not huge, but considering that it's Afrikaans media, they have 54,000 followers on the YouTube channel, which I think is quite exciting. And so there is this countercultural media things happening. Often, like with the Antwoord, it doesn't stick. But I think in the case of Prating or Van Pletsen, there's more of that. Then the other thing that also obviously happens is bands that were on the margin, like Folk of Polisiekar and Fransjo van Cooke, now sings at Afrikaans is Groot, so they've kind of been swallowed by the bigger media monster, and of course the sad things like Vrye Weekblad having to close down because they don't have enough, and that was offering, to my mind, solid Afrikaans news, and they didn't have enough budget to keep the publication open. So there's definitely a money machine about it, but I would like to still remain optimistic about some of the things that's happening. And then to speak to the film question, it is definitely true that these kinds of films that sorry, let me just scroll here, that I'm losing my place now, that the previous question about the film, sorry, I lost it. Danielle asked, is it does get a bigger pool, I guess, and it's because of this underlying narrative of the Afrikaner that we're connected to land and we have to fight for the land, and even contemporary text will often make use of this. But I think that there are also some exciting things happening in Afrikaans television and Afrikaans film which counter these narratives. So I would like to think that maybe there is some kind of pushback even from within. I don't know how much traction it will create, but as long as it's happening, I'm optimistic about it.
Okay, another comment about media that's actually not at all a comment about media. So MJ writes in the comments that SABC had a scheduling error with their Afrikaans news programming. This raised concerns about silent pulling of the Afrikaans news off air, which of course is seen as an attack on Afrikaner identity. And Audrey responds that, you know, this could easily be weaponized on X by you-know-who. It's quite funny that we don't mention his name anymore. We should just call him South African Voldemort at this stage. Oh, you can't make J.K. Rowling jokes anymore either, because she's also not so great. Anyway, that's another conversation as well. You know, for me, this comment is actually really important because it's less about an SABC scheduling error, and it's more about the fact that there is this tendency, not just in South Africa, but particularly among South African white people, to jump on things as markers of imminent death. I think it was Robert Thornton, who's an anthropologist at Wits, who I'm very, I read this paper years ago, and he uses the term rolling apocalypse. He says white people live in a state of rolling apocalypse in South Africa. We are always waiting for the race war. We are always waiting for the maids and the gardeners to come with the pangas and murder us in our beds, right? There's this constant sense that doom is only ever one step away. So when something happens, like SABC pulling Afrikaans news off, suddenly everyone gets very, very anxious and very afraid because it seems like identity is under threat. We do see the same things among white communities elsewhere. This is what the entire Great Replacement myth is built about. You know, that Obama getting elected meant that all white people were going to get pushed into the sea. But I was hoping that you could maybe say something about what this kind of very, very, very paranoid, reactive, neurotic, I guess, tendency in white Afrikanerdom to assume that any slight change, a change of name, of a road or a town, and this is something that Steve Hofmeyr did a lot of, is actively part of a genocidal urge, is actively a part of an urge to wipe Afrikaners off the face of the map, that there is this kind of overwhelming paranoia that without huge amounts of defense and without the lager, Afrikanerdom will cease to exist.
I'll jump in there because somebody else is jumping in, but you should stop me now. I think it has to do with what I mentioned, is that that Afrikaners have always perceived themselves as a threatened identity because it is so constructed and so and comes from so many various places. It's always had to be defended as not quite wide enough, as not quite Western enough, as not quite European enough. So I think there's a this narrative of victimhood is not a new one. I think it is almost a characteristic, I guess, of the Afrikaner identity plays out, or is always on the defensive instead of being proactive, I guess.
I can add to that. Nicky, I've also wondered about this so much because sure, fear has always been part of our history, but it's this question of why we cannot get further, why cannot we get past the fear? And it's this thing that chases us And I almost feel like even in my personal affective life, fear would be the affect that I associate most with. So I've had many conversations with friends about, why are we so scared? Like, what is this thing? And we've speculated, but I'm not saying this in a serious way, but like maybe there's something like really genetic in it, or something that apparently we came from different kinds of ships at the time, and there was lots of violence, or I don't know. I'm not saying this in a serious way, but my friends and I have considered that it might be like something built into our cells. It's just this fear, because it really is the dominant defining affect of this ethnic identity, or shall we say political ethnic identity, that we just cannot get past for it, and I don't understand why.
I mean,
So,
sorry. I mean, I'm more interested in the next question, but I wanted to quickly say to Azille's point. I mean, there is a long history of that. I mean, the whole, I mean, what is it? The whole idea of the lager, right? It's all in the 20th century, especially. The whole politics is about fear of the outsider. I mean, it's constructed around that. So I don't think we even have, I know you were saying, you were joking, like whether or not it has to do with like boats or how we got here. But I think there's a long history of the whole politics of during apartheid, of defining yourself again. You know, it's the political representatives, which is what I think the next question was about, has always been about preserving, building walls. There's this kind of thing at the door, at the window, was trying to come that's trying to get into the house. And I think with the end of apartheid, if the prevailing emotion is one of loss, and people forget also in this piece I did, the second Afrikaner state in cyberspace, people also forget that when the period between 94 and roughly, I would say till 99 is often described, is describing this like the miracle, or in this politics is one of reconciliation, when in fact it's actually a politics of like stacking up, you know, inside the house, like fearing change, very negative about the TRC, Lieg en Bieg Commissie, as I remember, like a phrase I think that was used in the Afrikaans media. So it's like, I think it's forgotten like how this was set up. And so it's very hard then to lose that. And then it gets reinforced during this Anglo-Boer War centenary, gets picked up during Plus Kras Kordaat. You know, you have to like go read these things and you'll see it. I'm not shocked when it comes out as this kind of the way that Steve Hofmeyr then, the politics that Steve Hofmeyr and AfriForum then exploited.
Okay, we are running very, very low on time, so we're going to have to wind this up. But there are some really fantastic questions that have just popped up. Always goes that way, doesn't it? Really detailed questions always come up right at the end of the panel. So I think what we should do is I'm going to read out the last few questions that we have, and then each speaker can take a minute or two to respond to those questions, and then we will close up for the evening. So firstly, the first question is from Peter Du Plessis, who says, so far we've talked about cultural production. I'm curious about your thoughts on political representation. On the one end, one would imagine that a counter-political voice is needed to rise above the dominance of groups like AfriForum and Co. Does this exist? And should it? Or does it run the risk of feeding further into the emerging ethno-nationalist politics we see in South Africa? And then Fred Cicada asks, what part does guilt about apartheid still play in the big question we're asking? And what happens, how does this work for the new generation of white Afrikaans kids, the Gen Zs, etc.? Do they think of their identity as Afrikaners or not? And what might their future political stance or involvement be? This is a question I would love to answer, having taught at Wits for 12 years, but I'm going to leave it to our speakers to think through. And then finally, one last question from Peter, who would also like to hear more from Siphiwe, so maybe this can be your contribution, about the globality of whiteness and its connection to who speaks for the Afrikaner. Is this, in a way, the fate or the case of Afrikaners are used by white Christian nationalists to point to the fear of its own downfall? It's not actually about Afrikaners, but about other dominant white groups in places like Germany, the US, the Netherlands, etc. I think this is an incredibly potent question. It's also a question that, you know, we should be applying to diasporic Jews who are playing a very, very useful role for America's internal politics at the moment. And it's obviously the role that they're playing is not being described in that way. Azille, let's start with you.
I think I will comment on the guilt and shame one. Obviously, it's difficult to speak in such abstract terms just for the culture in general, but I would say, in my experience, many Afrikaners are not feeling a lot of guilt. It's for some reason, the young ones are saying apartheid had nothing to do with me. The older ones are saying they didn't know. But I do think the affect that is more defining related to guilt, but something else is shame, that there is a deep cultural shame. And this comes also from a kind of racial anxiety of forever. And I think a lot, like all these layers in our history, contribute to a deep shame. And as we know, shame is very harmful when it's turned outwards. It's a very violent, it can have very violent results. So I would say shame is the bigger problem. And if we had more guilt, maybe that would be good.
Okay, Siphiwe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, especially if you think about the fact that, I mean, why shouldn't you be scared, right? You came into somebody's land, you took it by force, and you told them that they were not worthy, and then their sense of self comes back and assures them. Of course, you should be scared because whatever house you built was built on a mythological narrative about your superiority, right? And now the house is crumbling. So yes, you know, like, I mean, tongue in cheek, of course you should be scared, right? But I think that being scared should also then invite a sense of self-reflection around, okay, why are we so beholden to this narrative of supremacy, of purity, of greatness, when actually so much of white culture has destroyed a lot of things, and then now is reclaiming them as new indigenous knowledge that, oh, we should have paid attention to the way in which people in Africa were rearing cows because, you know, it didn't kill the environment. So I think shame, guilt, lack of willingness to actually accept that one was wrong, you know, and I think that for me, that's where the failure of the TRC came in that a lot of people who actually could have said, look, I was wrong, and that could have been a really good starting point, right? But they went defensive, as I agree with you, Azille, because of the shame that's not really been reflected on communally, right? So I think and I think this ties in well with this whole question of, well, why is this kind of global reach then of white angst all of a sudden around the other? Well, it's always been there because the other now is saying, look, I'm tired, I'm done, right? You took, okay, let me come to your place then and sit there. How would you like that, right? And all of a sudden, migrants are a problem. Oh, but you went to do civilizational work in the name of, you know, migrancy. So what's the problem here? So I think there's a lot of kind of self-reflection that is happening in this kind of white communities, where then people are also saying, but we were not part of that generation. And so how does then one speak of intergenerational trauma in the context of white supremacy ideology? I think that's, for me, an interesting kind of psychoanalytical question that white people have to kind of be thinking about in this current moment. Yeah.
Hannelie, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I think Zoma Mbata makes an interesting point in the comments, and that is what my answer to this question would be is I think there's too little guilt on the part of people that are speaking the loudest on behalf of the Afrikaner, and then maybe I agree that there's more. I think in preparation for tonight, I listened to a conversation between Bauer Bosch and Ernst Roots. And this was after a public debate started because Bauer publicly apologized. And then the blowback from that apology was that he was born after apartheid ended. So what is he apologizing for? And his argument was that you don't have to be guilty of something to say that I'm sorry that this happened to you. So I think there's some and that's exciting for me. And those are generations that come afterwards. But I think two things are happening here. You see people who, and we've spoken very little about the Boer stereotype, right? What's exciting to me, or no, not exciting, interesting to me, is how young people who have really no link to the farm buys into this farm aesthetic and farm narrative. You can see it in the kind of Buffelsfontein, Brandewyn, valleys, beards. So it's a performance of something that's a stereotype where there's no real link, because most of them do not come from the farm. So I think there's two things happening here where there is, and I think unfortunately the speakers or the performers who pay less attention to the guilt that they should be are speaking the loudest at the moment, at least on an international stage or in the America debate.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Okay, we are officially out of time. So Sean, if you could wind us up with your final comments.
I'm gonna have 1 minute. I think usable pass. I like talking always about usable pass. I think there's a way. Well, there is something I know. I was talking to you about this, Nicky, the other day. There's very little introspection and being quiet, and I think there was a whole debate about this in South Africa in the sort of at the beginnings of the 2010s about some more introspection, and the people who made those calls are often shouted down. I think it would be useful to go back and revisit those debates. But just in terms of usable pass, I think we should look back at some of the, we South Africans, we've struggled against apartheid to construct society that is not based on race. I mean, again, and of course, once we get there, we have to work that out. But if you go back and you look at the 1970s, if you look at the politics of the UDF in the 1980s, or COSATU, or the farm workers unions, or the food and allied workers unions, you can actually see how they've grappled with race. And I would recommend that people go back and look at those debates again. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So many thanks to our speakers. Huge thanks as well to the Innovation Foundation for putting this together with us and suggesting it in the first place. And to all of you for logging in. As we've been having lots of quiet backstage conversations about the fact that there's obviously a lot more to say about this. So hopefully we'll be able to find a way to maintain these conversations in one way or another. And yeah, thank you for logging in. If you're not on our mailing list, let me know and I'll add you, because this will hopefully be the start of an ongoing series of events.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.